Hello, good evening from the smiling coast of Africa, the Gambia. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, good night, wherever you may be. Welcome to Apps Media In Depth. Tonight is a night as we're going to honestly learn a lot about somebody that many in the Gambia do not know. And the person to do that is someone we all know. And trust me, we are here to learn. And there's no better way to learn about this person we are coming to talk about other than Mr. Madi Jobarteh. And who is he that we are coming to learn about this evening? He is known other than Edward Francis Small, or E.F. Small to some. Good evening, Mr. Jobarteh, from my end here in the Smiling Coast.
Good evening. Good to be here.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure, honestly, to always have you around and to learn from you always. This evening, we are here to honestly learn about Edward Francis Small, E.F. Small to some. Yes. Who was Edward Francis Small?
Thank you. I'm sure even you, we were never taught about Edward Francis Small when we were in school.
Not at all, sir.
Nowadays, the kids, I think part of their SCS or so, have some, at least I'm not sure even a chapter or I mean, they have on Edward Francis Small, but then some mention is made of Edward Francis Small. So Vicente, I mean, as far as I am concerned, Edward Francis Small is the father of Gambian independence.
Wow, father of Gambian independence.
Yes.
Tell us more.
So that, I'm still learning, took time to, at a certain point in my life, I, was digging deep to really find out the history of the Gambia, particularly the political history of the Gambia, and issues around independence and about human rights. I mean, this is, of course, a long time ago, 30 years, but then my click came, of course, following Jobe politics at the time. I mean, the writings of Halifa Sallah, Syria Jatta, and Foraya, and I've heard of the mention of E.F. Small. And I think it also generated a lot of interest in me to go further and study research about Edward Francis Small. And so in the process, I came to learn more and more about Edward Francis Small, not just his role in the Gambia, but in West Africa, in the Pan-Africanist movement, in the socialist movement in the world, so that you have somebody right in the Gambia seriously connected, with, movements and leaders in other parts of the world. For example, all the way in Russia at the time, of the Soviet Union, Black liberation fighters in America, and so on in Europe, and connecting with, leaders who began the struggle for decolonization, for the, liberation of our countries well before Kwame Nkrumah, or Patrice Lumumba or Amilcar Cabral. They had constituted themselves into what they call the National Congress of British West Africa, similar people in Sierra Leone, in Ghana, in Nigeria, how do you call it? IB Boris Johnson in Sierra Leone, and others in Ghana, Macaulay in Nigeria, and so on. So the connections, the mission, the vision, and the fight that E.F. Small was on, it's such a, I don't know, it's huge, but like, to imagine that today we talk about Kwame Nkrumah, we talk about, if you go to Sierra Leone, ITA Wallace Johnson, for example.
Wallace Johnson, and Herbert Macaulay
in Nigeria. Yeah, in Nigeria, and Cabral, then later people like Cabral, Kwame Nkrumah, and so on. But in the Gambia, one doesn't even talk about EF Small.
Why, if I
You
may
know,
ask?
exactly. So that when we go to the question first, who was Edward Francis Small? As I said, for me, he's the father of Gambian independence and one of the great leaders that West Africa and Black people have produced. And
Wow.
certainly, given his, as I said, international socialist, engagement, one of the great leaders that the, socialist movement, global movement, of social, the global socialist movement, has created. So his struggles for the defense of people in the Gambia against colonialism, when this Balangar incident happened,
Yes.
when they shot one of the armed robbers, I was telling
Armed robbers.
somebody, Balangar is the birthplace of activism in the Gambia, because that is
Wow.
where, Edward Francis Small, uh, kicked off his activism. That is where he actually became known for such, because he stood against, disrespect and
Colonialists
abuse.
and the
Yeah,
employers.
yeah, and so he's father of government independence, and that I don't want that to mean just independence in terms of the date, like
Yes.
independence, but
18 February.
yeah, but independence in terms of a lot of things, like his fight for farmers, because he was a fighter for farmers, leading to what eventually became known as the Gambia Cooperative Union. All right, that is part of our independence. His fight, for workers. All right, workers' rights. That's part of our independence. His fight as a journalist, to establish a newspaper and raising the issues of the people is part of our independence. So that
Right.
when you look into any aspect of independence, workers' rights, farmers' rights, fair price for
Right.
their produce, information, knowledge sharing, and so on. So the impact, the role that EF Small played is immense. And then we sit here today and hardly you hear EF Small being talked about. When I created the Edward Francis Small Center for Rights and Justice, which we can talk about later,
Later, yeah.
somebody all the way in the US, a Gambian, who is, above 50, said, I when I saw this press statement you made about launching your organization, I was surprised to about Edward Francis Small, because that, for me, I know of Edward Francis Small because there is a hospital in
Named
Banjul,
after
Francis Small
him.
Teaching Hospital. Yes, I said, but when that name was made, I had thought it was the name of some British guy.
Wow.
So I didn't know actually this is a Gambian, and particularly making that kind of contributions that you have highlighted. So I mean, which is both sad and explains the need for us to really go and learn about Edward Francis
Our
Small.
history,
Yeah.
indeed.
So for me, Edward Francis Small was a trade unionist, was a journalist, was an activist, for human rights, for farmers and everyone else, and was agitating for representative institutions in the Gambia. All right,
Right.
at the very beginning, that no taxation without representation. That Gambians pay tax, and so they pay tax. They have to have a say in the way that tax money is
Services.
managed.
Serving them.
Yeah. So that his agitations, for democracy, for Gambians to, govern this country because they pay tax and to have a say in that, led eventually to the colonialists succumbing to having, then they had the Banjul Legislative Council to open it up so that, they had made him a a
Inclusive.
councillor. Yes, in that, I mean, at the time, that was the only representative body in the Gambia, because Banjul was the colony and the rest of it was protectorate, which,
Protectorate.
the colonialists don't consider to be human beings, in fact, but
Exactly.
Yeah, sadly. So he managed to get in. They had to get him into that council, but eventually to make that council even elective, so that when it became elective in 1947, E.F. Small became the first person to be elected into that council, and
Wow.
that journey, all right, is what we saw develop until we get to a point where in the 50s, late 50s, that the colonialists know independence has to come, and then political parties began to form, and eventually all of those constitutional conferences in Banjul and in London, leading
Wow.
to eventually independence, which eventually came in 1970. you know
Wow.
so I mean, I think there's a lot more to research about EF Small, his role, his impact, his contributions, and so it is in honor of that we have decided to name our organization after him.
This is very informative, and I must confess that a lot of us do not know much about E.F. Small and his contribution. And you took it back to really his impact, not only in the Gambia, but in West Africa and outside of Africa.
Oh yeah.
And I believe, honestly, definitely, this is the right time for us to enlighten the younger generation.
Yeah.
And that before others,
Hmm.
there was somebody who was there,
Yeah.
who stood for, as you said, independence, that is self-wood, demanding for people's own rights
Yeah.
and ensuring that that which belongs to the
Mm.
collective
Yeah.
serves the purpose of the people. Now, who were the parents of Edward Francis Small? Where did he get his education? And what was he doing before he started this issue of rights and justice?
Well, so a whole book is written about Edward Francis Small by Nana Gray Johnson,
Yeah,
and
right.
it's called Edward Francis Small. In fact, he described him as the watchdog of the Gambia.
Gambia, watchdog. That is the journalistic part of him.
Yeah, but not just the journalistic part of it, because the
Right.
book also went into the life and work of Edward Francis Small as a trade unionist, as a
Yes.
journalist, as a supporter for farmers and independence and
Right.
so on, which I think should be a book that should be a reading list, in our university and in our institutions
His schools.
of learning. Yeah, so
Yes.
yes, Small. I must say the little that I have gathered about him, as I said, I'm still researching. But it's a typical uh, Gambian boy, Aku boy, born in Banjul,
Right.
who in fact would have gone into becoming a priest. Really,
Wow.
yes, and because he actually was working as a church boy. In fact, I mean, at one point with the Methodist mission, so that that's where his altercation with the Europeans began in Balangar. All right, but since 1919, all right, E.F. Small. I mean, not just before 1990, but even when he was a boy, his parents have noticed. Had noticed his interest in reading,
Wow.
but also, the kind of conversations he engages in, the kind of activities, the kind of ideas he, exposed or expressed at the
Propagated.
time. All
Right.
indicated that he wasn't just any ordinary boy. Yes, that
You,
he was a
you,
very conscious, sober, boy who became a gentleman, and that came to define, to reflect in his life all throughout. So, but at the time, of course, what Gambians can aspire to in terms of the colonial system is to serve, as clerks and so on. And so he worked in the colonial government, and as I said, also, in the mission, and and I think even at one point he was even sort of posted or went to work briefly in Sierra Leone, because at that time Gambia was also under
it's a
Freetown
review.
and
The
Banjul were
administration,
under
yeah.
administration. Yeah. So
True.
I mean, so that was him, a humble beginning, really. but someone who early on, had discovered his mission, I mean, had developed a sense of purpose, and,
Absolutely.
someone who, um, developed interest early, in his life about his surrounding, his time, and, his environment. So not just someone who just lives and then, as most of, some of our people would do. So, I mean, between, yeah, as early as he was, because he was born in, I think, 1898,
Wow.
something like that, 1898. So that by 1917, I mean, he began to lead protests. So again, that is another aspect of his life, uh, how he organized people. So he had
And
led a lot of protests in Banjul.
and
By
that's like
by 1917,
he was
yeah,
like just 19, 20 years.
yeah. So because he was born actually
Wow.
1891, 1891. So that,
Okay.
if you are 1917, you are almost
That
like
we are
20,
maybe
20, 20,
29.
20, 25 years.
5 years. Okay.
Yeah. So, he was a youth. He was less than 30 when he was, agitating for these things, leading protests,
Wow.
in Banjul, for someone below 30 at that time. So you can just see that this man had developed a huge sense of responsibility, a huge, awareness, consciousness about, his environment, his circumstances, and therefore someone who had discovered his mission as to what should be my mission in society, which I think is the fundamental question we need to face our young people with today.
That's
What is your mission? You know, one of our great leaders, Franz Fanon, Franz Fanon had said this in his book, The Wretched of the
erected on
Earth.
the earth.
Yes, I mean, each generation must discover its mission, to
Yes.
fulfill or betray. So that, I think we need to have a whole conversation about that, at one point, with the government youths. What is
Right.
your mission? Have you discovered your mission? And how are you prepared to fulfill that
Fulfill
mission,
it or to
or to
betray
betray
it.
that mission? Yeah. So this was EF Small, humble beginning, as I said, but someone who does not just want to live, because you can live in society, you can live through society, without really making society live. But he
Right.
wanted to make society live. He just don't want to live, but he wants society itself to live. And to live is to have a sense of purpose,
Wow. Thank you very
And
much,
yeah,
Madi.
yeah,
Welcome to In Depth once again by Apps Media. Madi, definitely what you've just brought out is very telling. And looking at EF Small and his lineage or the ethnic group he's from, you would consider him to be definitely quote unquote well off. But here was somebody who refused the comfort of his own ethnic group and decided to actually represent or stand for others. That is something definitely to me, which you need to let us know more about. As you said, the protectorate at the time was not considered as anything. So Banjul was the colony and everything was centered around Banjul. He chose to go to Balanga, which is actually in the protectorate.
yeah.
What can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So it all reflects the deep sense of purpose, and the mission that EF Small discovered and dedicated himself to. Because one, as you said, I mean, to accept, agree to go to Balangar, which would be part of the colony, and of course would have more severe conditions than in Banjul. It indicates a man, with a sense of humility, with a sense of service, But above all, what it also shows, Vicente, Amita Cabral also talked about this, the class suicide,
Yes.
because he just did not go to Balangar. Okay, he didn't just go to Balangar, but he was ready to take a position that potentially, and it did,
Protected.
deny him, no, would deny him privilege and
Privileges.
status. All right, because at the time he could say, well, I have a good status,
Yes.
I have a good job, I'm in peace, who cares? But he said, let that be damned. I will stand for justice. I will stand for my principles. And so if that means losing privilege, let me lose privilege.
That's right.
All right. Now, this matter came up during the Guinea-Bissau Liberation War, when Cabral was recruiting, organizing our people in Guinea-Bissau. That you have people working in the colonial system who they may not like colonialism and the Portuguese and so on, but they also did not come to join it because the fight, because the privilege, the status, the benefits they were getting from the colonial system was such that they didn't want to abandon that. And Cabral said, look, we have to commit class suicide, that we abandon this privileged class and go to live and work with our poor class, our people. Because when we liberate, until we liberate, then of course, it doesn't matter. So Cabral himself, as a graduate from university from Portugal, and had all the benefits around him, all the privileges, could have stayed in Bissau, and enjoy the privileges of colonialism. But he said, look, I'm going to stop it and go to my people. This is what, well before Cabral did that, Cabral said class suicide, E.F. Small had committed class suicide already.
Wow.
So, and this is the lesson that the intellectuals particularly, because in his time, in his circumstances, E.F. Small was an intellectual, just like how Cabral was an intellectual. Just like how you and I are intellectuals today, but are we ready to commit that class suicide, to abandon those privileges and benefits,
the
status that our positions give us, to say we are going to align with the issues, with the concerns, with the aspirations, with the conditions, to sympathize with the conditions of our people. This is what E.F. Small demonstrated when he left Banjul to go to Balangar, but not just to go to Balangar, to confront power in Balangar, power that eventually, when he did that, the Methodist Church suspended him. And eventually he had no job. The colonialists, he wrote so many petitions to the colonial government, protested and, did everything to the point that the colonial governor, in one of his dispatches to London, described E.F. Small as a man who finds protest irresistible. How did he describe him, in fact? A self-appointed champion of non-existent grievances.
Self-appointed champion of non-existent grievances.
No, the colonialists, they are dangerous. Can you imagine that kind of description? That's how they describe him. Yes, a man who finds protest irresistible. But so he was ostracized. I mean, imagine E.F. Small died, outside of the Gambia.
Really? Where?
In Rafisque. He was exiled in Rafisque. I mean, he came
in Senegal.
Rafisque
in Senegal.
Yeah,
wow.
in Dakar. But yeah, he came back. He then went to London, to continue his protest there, came back again. In fact, at one point, the colonial governor extended an olive branch to him.
Wow.
Yes. And he went to London, so his eventual exile was in Rafisque,
Wow.
So all of that to abandon privilege, all right, to refuse benefits when the people are suffering, when the people are oppressed and exploited. So this was what E.F. Small did. And that is the meaning, the lesson that we the Gambians of today, particularly our young intellectuals, yes, need to ask themselves, I'm going to the University of the Gambia for what purpose, really? For what purpose? Yes. All right. So that is what is our mission. What is my mission, for this education I'm seeking? So, Vicente, that's why some of us, we've been inspired by E.F. Small, all right? And, and that his path is the only path we will follow.
Well, this is very revealing, and then now you and I can tell because of what you've just shared. This is the reason why he wasn't known. And maybe many don't want us to know about him because they don't seem to honestly support that which he stood for, which may dismantle the foundation of a lot of falsehood. Here you are talking about E.F. Small,
Yeah.
and he had no mention in our history books before now because I never read about him at high school, never actually did about him at university, and so he was not actually even definitely in any way celebrated or honored by, I'm not sure, any of our regimes besides the naming of the hospital after him, which to me is something I need to know. Was he actually somebody in the medical fraternity to have a hospital named after him? To me, the university or a learning institution or an institute of rights and justice somewhere in the university could be named after him too, because that's what actually he stood for. I'm not saying definitely that the hospital has no meaning or link to whatever he was doing, but definitely I trust he died because of defending rights and standing for justice, actually, being with the oppressed, and definitely more or less fighting against colonialism and the oppressors.
Hello, say that again. I missed the message.
What I'm trying to say is your submission
Yeah.
may be the reason why they've not actually taught us or told us a lot more about E.F. Small because of his vision and his mission, which definitely he took upon himself to liberate the people based on the education he received. Instead of the privileges that he would have had, he sacrificed them to represent others.
Yeah, I mean, he sacrificed a lot, and it's unfortunate we have not been taught about E.F. Small, and he was in a medical doctor, even though they named the hospital after him, uh, which is still not bad because I mean he's a national leader,
Right,
and so we can name our public places after him.
right,
And I wished we had named many more things after him. But more
true.
importantly, I wished um, he was celebrated
More,
by making him a subject in our schools. I mean, a topic in our schools, so
right.
that from primary school people are
Mm,
introduced to
mm,
Edward Francis Small
mm.
all the way through. Um, Unfortunately, that is not the case. It's one of the things we will advocate for
Right,
as part of this organization.
right.
But yeah, I mean, you know, uh, his life is a big lesson to so many things to learn from, and
Mm,
he dedicated his life really to serve humanity, to serve Gambians. As I
mm,
said, it was not just Gambians, but long before we talk about independence of in Africa, let's say
mm.
the 1945 Manchester Pan-Africanist Congress. I
Right.
mean, very early. I mean, probably soon after the 1900, Pan-Africanist conference in Manchester. I mean, in London.
Mm,
I think the next conference was 1919 in France, in
mm.
Paris. But by that time already they had established the National Congress of British West Africa,
West
which is the
Africa.
liberation of. So it was to serve West Africans, and then
Mm,
of course he was into all the anti-colonial, pro-independence movements at the time, connecting
mm,
with individuals in the Caribbean, in America, in Europe, but also in the wider socialist, movement,
movement.
with I mean activists in Europe, in Asia, I mean
Mm,
in China, but also and this is even well before China, the Communist Party took over in China. So he was
right.
getting literature from those areas and publishing it, in his newspaper in the Gambia called the Senegambia Reporter.
The report.
He had I mean, and again, the belief, today we talk about Senegambia, but there
Mm,
was somebody who was talking about Senegambia well before we all talked about Senegambia.
that's
Yeah.
right.
So, I mean, at that time, I don't think there was any institution, any organization talking about Senegambia. when he was naming his
Newspaper, the Senegal
newspaper, the
report.
Senegambia reporter, at the time when Gambia and Senegal were not even
They are not
independent
even
countries.
independent. That
Yeah,
is true. That is
so
true.
the lesson in the man's life,
Hmm.
man, is huge.
It
So
is.
that we come this far, 100 years later today, 100 years today, you know, Gambia and Senegal stay separate. I mean, yeah, Small's idea was for Gambia and Senegal to be one.
To be together. Hmm.
And we are one people. I mean, I would say Gambia, Senegal, Guinea-Bissau should be one country,
True.
you know.
Hmm.
But I mean, the
Well,
Senegalians,
the boundaries may be there, but the people are one. As
people
you
are
can
one.
see, even in the way we relate, if there is any religious function, you will see everybody from the Gambia going to Senegal or the
Yeah,
opposite direction.
yeah, yeah,
If
yeah,
there is any, cultural or funeral, whatever, you see some people finding their way to Guinea-Bissau and others to the Gambia.
yeah,
So basically, as you said, it is
yeah,
the colonialists that actually divided us through the boundaries, but the
yeah.
people are still together.
Yeah. I mean, it pains my heart if I see Gambians and Senegalese, speak, so negatively about each other, and the Guinea-Bissau, the stereotypes. I mean, currently I'm actively engaged with this Guinea-Bissau civil society and the media. Just
Right.
yesterday or 2 days ago, we issued a statement. Wrote a letter to Jomai Fai, protesting his invitation to Embalo. All right, and we are working together to deal with the situation in Guinea-Bissau, and I brought these issues to the government civil society. Government civil society should government people should stand with Guinea-Bissau as they should stand with Senegal, and vice versa, because I mean we are all one in Africa, but I mean, even in a village, there are families. Even in the compound, there are houses. I mean,
True.
boom bijele. I
What
understand.
we do, you told
Yeah.
that.
So when it comes to Africa, boom killing is Senegal, Gambia, and Guinea-Bissau.
That's
You know.
true.
Yeah, and it's hard. We remain separated. As it is. But I mean, all just go to show the fight that EF Small was fighting. I think Gambians are yet to really know this man and appreciate his role.
And that is why you are giving this platform to educate us because
You know?
Lombalia like a kudo for Sambana. And I agree with you that definitely a lot of people, it's out of ignorance that they do certain things.
Yeah.
But some, it may be deliberate. And that's why I said the reason why maybe Edward Francis Small was not actually brought to us or introduced to us, or actually, the colonialists at the time who didn't want anything said about him because he
No.
was the thorn on their flesh, as
Yeah.
you've just given the description that they gave about him,
Yeah.
right? So they would never want anything about him to be mentioned.
Yeah.
That is number one. Number two, knowing what we now know, I think, as you said, it is the university, among others, that should definitely dig deep and go down to look at some of our past leaders that were vilified, crucified, and seen as if they were against, the establishment to be studied. Maybe they were the ones standing for us. But because of the establishment at the time, they were seen actually more or less as the bad, apple among the rest.
Yeah. I mean, the colonialists. No, they will never talk about EF Small. No, no. Yeah, no. As typical anywhere, they will never talk about the colonized. They will never celebrate the colonized. The oppressed. I mean, the exploited. It's just a tragedy that
It's the same way. It's the same way that they will not talk about America Cabral. They will
Yeah,
not talk about Kwame Nkrumah. They will not
yeah,
talk about Patrice Lumumba,
yeah,
because at the time they saw these people to have been anti-establishment and were painted in a way and manner
yeah,
that a lot of even us Africans still
yeah,
believe what we are reading about these people from the books written by people who
yeah.
were not there for us.
Yeah. I mean, you read Western narratives, the way they demonize ridicule, caricature Cabral or Nkrumah or Lumumba. And, not long ago, I saw a Nigerian colleague who read a book written by this British author, Jeremy Bentham, something like that. And Martin Meredith, yeah. Martin Meredith, that is this British writer, he's a so-called expert on Africa and said to have been a journalist since colonial days and, reported about Africa all over the place. And he wrote books, about Africa. I remember one of his first books I've read, The First Dance of Freedom, you know. And you read the book and the books he wrote about Africa. So I told the colleague, I said, this is a book you need to promote on social media for Africans to read. It's unfortunate you don't know your history. We've not been taught our history. But I said, this man's books, are our story from the point of the view of the colonialist, from the
Exactly.
oppressor. And
The
so what
oppressed.
they do is to demonize our leaders.
That's right.
But I said, I don't see any great leader UK has produced greater than Cabral, greater than Kwame Nkrumah, or greater than Lumumba.
Even
So
Nelson Mandela, look at the way he
yes,
was vilified, sent to jail for 27 years.
yeah,
He came out of jail and see
yeah,
the way the people who even persecuted him
yeah,
were starting to celebrate him.
yeah. So
As if,
yeah,
actually,
yeah, and that Nelson Mandela, they had called him a terrorist.
there you go.
So, typical of colonialists and imperialists, as I said, they call E.F. Small a champion of non-existent grievances who finds, so, no,
Unfortunately.
they will not talk about this. But that is our onus, that is our responsibility to ourselves, to posterity, and even to the world,
And the unfortunate thing is they use us against
yeah. Yeah,
one
yeah,
another.
yeah. So that
Because
today you go to conferences, you meet with African intellectuals, and they will tell you Nkrumah was a dictator. Comments like that. Vicente, and nuclear water, nuclear water, nuclear water.
no, and nuclear Warland, because the saddest thing is some of us actually still actually go by the teachings of those people outside of Africa.
Yeah, yeah,
And and we up to now are still even struggling
yeah,
to identify ourselves, as you said now.
yeah,
Gambia, Senegal, Guinea, and Guinea-Bissau. Now, if we see each other as foreigners, where is the African identity we're talking about?
sadly. Yeah,
When our own freedom fighters were coming together to fight against the colonialists.
yeah. So, Vicente, this is why I tell African activists, and not just African activists, even European activists, human rights defenders, human rights organizations. That I tell the African organizations first. A lot of African networks, movements. I told them, if you are a human rights defender in Africa, if you are a civil society organization in Africa, Pan-Africanism should be a priority.
It should be.
Yeah, Pan-Africanism should be a priority, and imperialism should be a priority, should be an agenda.
That's right.
So I describe Edward Francis Small Center for Rights and Justice as a Pan-Africanist and imperialist organization, human rights organization. Because Pan-Africanism provides us a mechanism, a framework, within which we will secure the rights and dignity of African people. At the same time, anti-imperialism, which is rooted in white supremacist ideology and and narratives, is what gave birth to slavery and colonialism, and to apartheid, to the Nakba in Palestine, to the racism that exists, in Europe today, like Trump in America and so on. So it should be an agenda of human rights defenders, of activists, of everyone, that anti-imperialism you know, that is an agenda to fight against. Through that, we should fight what imperialism and white supremacy have produced: racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, and Islamophobia, and so on, to fight those things, because these are the things that are at the heart of the human rights violations, the genocides, the crimes against humanity, the war crimes, which recently today, when people watch Palestine and Gaza, I tell them, uh, what is happening in Palestine. If you know history, you will realize that 500 years ago is what happened in the Gambia when so-called Portuguese explorers and Christopher Mosto, all right, and so on, came to our shores and entered our lands.
And took our people.
Yeah, our people, they came with the imagination of slavery. Is the imagination, it is the invention, all right? And they came and imposed slavery and colonialism on our people. It's just like how Christopher Columbus, all right, and all those, British, French, Spanish, Italian people left to go to America and occupy it. How the Dutch people left Netherlands and went to South Africa to occupy it, to Australia, to New Zealand. All right, they went to India. It is the same how people left, all right, believing that we are superior, we have the audacity to go and go anywhere and take. And that is what is playing in our lifetime today in Palestine. All right, and this is why, because that is what imperialism is. What today we see Trump saying when he says, Panama, I'm going to take Panama Canal. I'm going to change Gulf of Mexico to Gulf of America. I'm going to take Greenland. Why is he thinking like that? That's the imperialist thinking. His forebears, when they left Scotland, when they left England, they went to Canada, went to America, went to Jamaica, went to Brazil, went to all those places and take it. All right? Usually, Greenland has people, native people of Greenland. Greenland doesn't belong to Denmark, but it is the same imperialist white supremacist thinking that made Denmark go and take Greenland, which is 1,000 times bigger than Denmark. Yeah, you forget that human beings live here, you go and take their land and take it and say this is green, this is Denmark, and this is called Greenland. Greenland is not Greenland. The people of Greenland, they have a name for Greenland. It's like how we have a name for the Gambia and Senegal. That's the Europeans imposing on us. Is how they went to, such the roads went to South America, Southern Africa, and you look at the waterfall. How do they call it? Our people call it
Victoria Falls.
No. Our people have a name for it. Mosi Watunya, something like that. The water that thunders. That is how people in Zambia, they call it their language. The water that thunders. So the roads you go there, it's like me, I go to London and stand by the River Thames and say, I, Madi Jobarteh, I have hereby discovered this river, and this river is now going to be called Boraba.
That's true.
Yeah, and I think I should do that. I will go to London and stand in front of the Thames River and make a declaration that this river, I have discovered this river now. It is now going to be called River Boraba. River Boraba. You know what I'm saying? But this is what the white supremacists.
Yeah.
All right?
So in short, we cannot have peace in the world without justice.
We can have peace and justice. And what we have to know is what is affecting justice, what is causing injustice. And what is causing injustice is white supremacy, is imperialism, is racism, is tribalism. You go to the Gambia, the tribalism, the corruption, all right? These are what is causing the injustice. And this is what we have to fight. Yes, that corruption, that bigotry, that exists in the Gambia, that tribalism that exists there,
self-entitlement,
that self-entitlement, and all of that, regardless of who is saying it, who is doing it, That is what we got to fight. And Vicente, we have formed Edward Francis Moore Center not just as a Pan-Africanist, anti-imperialist,
Realist.
anti-Semitic, or anti-racist organization, but also, as a Republican and a democratic organization. All
That's
right,
right.
that is in the Gambia to fight for republicanism, to fight for democracy.
So
And
what is it
this is the
there?
fight we are on.
What is it there for the Edward Francis Small Center for Rights and Justice in the next 5 years, especially definitely working with the university or young minds to let them understand their purpose and the purpose of their education
You,
within
you,
Africa and the African continent?
it's good you mentioned 5 years because but Vicente, all these days, I mean, not just these days, but since we established it in October
Right,
2024,
right,
we gathering, we setting it up. And one of the tools we are putting together is a strategic plan. And it was
excellent.
just yesterday that the full draft
Right.
was completed. All right. And it's a 5-year strategic plan.
And you see, and I've not read it, I've not seen
You
it.
know, and I'm sure you're gonna get a copy because our strategy plan and the organization as a whole, Vicente, is founded on 5 pillars.
Right.
5 pillars: freedom, equality, empowerment,
Right.
transparency, and accountability.
Wow.
Yes.
Freedom, equality.
Equality, empowerment,
Uh-huh.
transparency, and accountability.
Wow.
These are the 5 pillars of our strategy.
Uh-huh.
Yes, these are the 5 pillars of our strategy. And each of these components, are well expressed in the strategy in terms of the objectives, in terms of our focus areas, in terms of our activities we will do, in terms of, our partnerships, in terms of our goal.
Right.
All right. So that, we're hoping to finalize it, in this month because, Vicente, this month is a significant month in the Gambia.
Really, April.
April,
Tell me
yeah.
more.
Yeah, because April, we know April 10 and 11. It's a
That's
day
true.
Gambian students got up to resist oppression in the Gambia. We know April 16 was another day political activists that were Solo Sandeng got up also to resist. All right. And that resistance on April 16, April 17, 18, political leaders from his party, picked that up to demand his body dead or alive. All right. Eventually, galvanized Gambians until we got the change that we got eventually in 2016. All right. But it is also in this April 24th, that the Gambia became
A
an
republic.
independent republic. We at Edward Francis Small do not consider 1965 as our Independence Day because 1965 we were a dominion, a colony under the British Empire.
Empire.
Yes, we became fully independent. All
On
right,
April 24th.
on April 24th, 1970. So April is a significant month for Edward Francis Moore Center for Rights and Justice. And it is in this April we will also unveil our strategic plan. Yes. So we are working towards that. I mean, if resources permit, we wanted to unveil the organization itself formally. And our plan was to do that in Balangar, because as I said, Balangar
Yes. It
is
was
the
where it all started.
birthplace of activism in the Gambia.
Right.
It is the birthplace of the activism of EF Small, and so symbolically, we would have gone to Balangar to do our, but it is in the plans. Yeah, yeah.
Well, that's good. So the Edward Francis Small Center for Rights and Justice stands for freedom, which is
Equality,
actually enshrined in our national anthem,
absolutely.
right? Equality, which
Yeah,
actually is universal right.
yeah.
Empowerment, which you are actually
Empowerment.
doing right now because
Yeah,
you are educating and enlightening us.
yeah,
Transparency, which is actually key and core
yeah,
to sustainable development and
yeah,
accountability.
yeah,
Because you cannot definitely take charge of issues and not account at the end of the day. You cannot be
Absolutely.
in charge of the people and not be accountable to them. So
Absolutely.
this is wonderful, and I hope and pray that the young ones will not only learn about these things, but will actually live by them and implement them, and definitely take cue from people like Edward Francis for
Absolutely.
small, a better world. Because 100 years since he started all this, we cannot be 100 years behind.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You are spot on.
Well, thank
so
you very
so
much. I'm learning, and
yeah.
trust me, as I said, we should continue the advocacy and the enlightenment, because not many people knew about him, and those ones can be forgiven because they were ignorant.
Yeah.
But now that they are watching this, nobody can have any excuse of not knowing.
Well, we have a responsibility. We have a duty.
That's right.
As human beings, and I think at the core of it, whether it's religion or culture, for
Right.
me, this is the lesson people should learn. And when we look at nature,
Right.
why are we alive? Why are we living? Why are
What's
we?
our purpose on this
Yeah,
earth?
what's our
Yeah.
purpose? So that when you look at it, the way we are made, the way society is made, it is not made for one person to live on your own. With all the capabilities that the Almighty gave the human being,
Right.
He did not give the human being the capability to live alone.
I know.
It's to live in a community.
No one is an island anyway.
In fact, no one can be an island, because you won't survive.
You won't.
Because at the end of the day, your life is finite. I mean,
Yes.
you are a mortal man.
True.
So that will be the end of you if you want to live alone, because
Alone.
you will end at one point. But the whole idea of therefore society is that it lives forever, because while each of us die individually, the
Right.
society does not die because we reproduce, and
True.
that reproduction cannot happen by our individual selves, is by community. But also, it is not just to live, it's to live in an environment that is healthy, that is secure, that is safe. And one person cannot guarantee that. That is
True.
guaranteed by all, by transferring knowledge, by transferring skills, by creating rules, by giving each other ambition and hope,
True.
and so on. So that when we put all of that together, that is our mission. How do we make this life better? So
Thank you
people have
very
to
much.
find, yeah, people have to understand what is the purpose of life, which I
Life.
think usually is what escapes us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Madi Jobarteh. Thank you very much for your time. I know this will not be the last.
Yeah.
It may be the first, because we will need you on this platform to educate people more, not only about Edward Francis Moore, but about this issue of Pan-Africanism you're talking about, as well as imperialism, because people
Yeah.
need to know,
Yeah.
and this is the time to question logic, and also maybe urge people to read more and know more about individuals who have vilified
Yeah.
before now. And that if Madi is actually going through it, he's not the first and he will not be the last. There were others there before him.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is why we are
So,
here. As I was saying, because of EF Small, we are here.
right,
And because of me and you, others will be there. And the journey
true,
continues. So EF Small left this world, more than 50 years ago.
right,
But we are still here. It is
yes,
his contribution and the contributions of many, many, many others, including our own parents, our family, and everyone else in the community. So that when
right,
one understands that, you realize, therefore, you don't have to be a parasite in society. You should also contribute to the advancement, the material advancement, the immaterial advancement, the freedom, the peace and stability of that country. You have a duty to contribute to it. Otherwise, you are a parasite. You are
wow,
ungrateful.
that's good.
So
So,
what
and
we are doing is an act of gratitude that we are doing.
that's, well, you're taking me back to school, in which actually Shakespeare, he may not be the right person to quote here, who said that to be ungrateful is monstrous, and for the monster to be ungrateful, we have to show a monster of the multitude.
Well,
And many of us fall victim of that. We
ah,
are always ungrateful, and gratitude is actually an attitude.
I would conclude that to say ungratefulness is the biggest sin a person can commit.
Ungratefulness is the biggest sin a person can commit, and I pray that I don't commit that sin, sir.
Me too.
Thank you very much for your time,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Jobarteh. Thank you very much for your enlightenment, your education, your empowerment. And I hope and pray that Apps Media will definitely have more of you, definitely on other topics. But
anytime.
Don't ever actually relent. You can always come here to educate people more about the Edward Francis Small Center for Rights and Justice, as well as educate the young ones, including some of us who may consider ourselves educated, but there's still a lot we need to unlearn, to learn, to earn. Thank you very much, Mr. Jobarteh.
Thank you, Mr. Andre. Keep it up. The struggle continues. Yeah.